back, everybody, for the second half of our first day of Student Scholar Days. And I'm Dr. Leslie Alvarez, and I have the distinct pleasure of being on the committee, but also being a mentor this year to Jennifer Cliff, who is a graduating psychology major. And I've also had the pleasure of knowing Jen since you were in my child development class and also as her advisor. So this is always a bittersweet time, someone who's such a wonderful student, getting to show their accomplishments, but also getting ready to leave. But we're very proud of Jen, and what she's going to be presenting is a project that she did for research methods. All of our students in research methods have to do original, independent, or group research project from beginning to end in 16 weeks. And this is what Jen did for her project last year, and she'll be presenting it to you today. So thank you. Let's give Jen a welcome.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to welcome you guys. Thank you for attending. I'm hoping that not everyone is so full from lunch that it's nap time. That would be bad. I also want to thank Dr. Alvarez for mentoring me through the process. It was an independent research project, and so her help and her guidance was paramount in getting it all put together. We will be looking at parenting style and how that relates to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation today. And so the goal of my research was to extend the findings of the relationship between authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive parenting styles and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This was intriguing to me because how we're raised in our formative years can have an impact on our academic careers into adulthood. And so how our parents parented us really has a lasting effect on how we operate in the world. Diana Baumrind originally described the parenting styles in 1966. She had three categories: authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive styles. And we'll take each of these one by one so you can see how she operationally defined these styles. So the first one, authoritative parenting, encourages dialogue between the parent and the child. So the parents encourage the child to come and ask questions. If they don't understand a rule that's in place, if they don't understand an expectation, these types of parents encourage the child to come and find out those answers. They hold the child accountable for his or her actions while lovingly guiding the child within the rules of the family structure and affirmation of positive choices. The children are expected to adhere to a high standard that the parents have set forth, and they're granted some degree of autonomy, which is independence. This is kind of the middle ground in the parenting continuum. You have authoritarian at one end, you have permissive at the other, and this authoritative is really the middle ground between the two. It's a more democratic way of parenting and more adaptive way of parenting as well. Then you have authoritarian parenting on one end of the spectrum. These parents rule with an iron fist. They expect their rules to be strictly adhered to by the child with little or no room for compassion. There is no verbal give and take. So with authoritative parents, we see, that they encourage the child to have a dialogue so that there's a high degree of understanding. These parents, that is not acceptable. This is a cold and impersonal way of parenting with little praise and plentiful punishment for non-adherence. Normally, it's a corporal type of punishment utilized within this type of parenting. These parents are very, very strict, and I think of it as it's my way or the highway type of parenting. Then, so you have authoritarian, authoritative, and then on the opposite end is permissive, where the permissive parents allow the child to self-regulate with little parental control. They are very lenient and tolerant of all the child's actions. They utilize little or no punishment techniques at all. I think of these as a laid-back, anything-goes type of parent. And so you can see that each style is very distinctive. We can probably, put our parents in each of a style, and if you are a parent, you can probably identify yourself with how these styles work within your own home. So now that we have the operational definitions of parenting style, we'll look at what exactly intrinsic and extrinsic motivation look like as well. Intrinsically motivated people participate in an activity, class, or learning environment for pleasure or mere satisfaction from the activity. They take enjoyment in simply learning and being challenged. So intrinsically motivated individuals, it's internal, it's within themselves. They enjoy being challenged, just gaining knowledge for the sake of having more knowledge. Whereas extrinsic motivated people engage in activities, classes, or learning environments as a means to an end. There's a goal in mind, a physical goal. They strive for tangible rewards such as good grades, praise from teachers, from professors, from parents, and recognition by others. And so you can see this is an externally driven way of, it's things outside of themselves. So now that we have these definitions in place and what those variables look like, we'll look at previous research. Previous research has linked authoritarian parenting to extrinsic motivation and authoritarian parenting to extrinsic motivation and authoritative parenting to intrinsic motivation. So what does that look like? We'll take the first one of authoritarian parenting to extrinsic motivation. So those people who identified as having more strict parents were more externally motivated by good grades, by praise from others. That's what that looks like. The second one, authoritative parenting to intrinsic motivation. Those who identified as having more democratic parents and autonomy-granting parents were more internally motivated. So they enjoy being challenged. They enjoy learning new things just for the sake of gaining knowledge. And then lastly, you see that the permissive parenting style was not linked to either motivational orientation in the previous research. So, based on the previous research, this is what I hypothesized. I hypothesized that those who scored high in authoritative parenting would also score high in intrinsic motivation due to the autonomy that they're granted through this parenting style. I also hypothesized that those scoring high in authoritarian parenting would score high in extrinsic motivation, and we would see this relationship due to the punishment avoidance behaviors. So, how did I do my research? I administered a survey throughout several classrooms on campus. The surveys included demographic information, it included the parental authority questionnaire measures, and it included the motivated strategies for learning questionnaires. Now, the one thing that I did change was, you can see that with the parental authority questionnaire, the PAQ, it was formulated during a time when the mother was the primary caretaker in the family. That is not necessarily true in today's society. We have a much more diverse family unit than we used to. And so I changed the matronly wording from mother to primary caregiver. And so that people that didn't fit that mold during a time when this was formulated, they could still identify with primary caregiver. And so I just changed that wording out to reflect grandparents, we see that a lot, aunts and uncles, and so on and so forth. So there wasn't that bias included within the PAQ on my survey. So we'll take a look at what each of the example questions might look like, so you get a feel of how that looks. So authoritative parenting, as I was growing up, once family policy had been established, my primary caregiver discussed the reasoning behind the policy with the children in the family. So you can see the wording, primary caregiver, where that would have said mother on the previous, the original one. And you can see the verbal give and take between the parent and the child, that the parents are encouraging the children to come in and get clarity on issues within the home. Then authoritarian parenting, even if their children didn't agree with them, my primary caregiver felt that it was for our own good if we were forced to conform to what they thought was right. So you see the very strict absolute rule, this is my way and this is what is expected of you. And then finally, the permissive parenting. While I was growing up, my primary caregiver felt that in a well-run home, the children should have their way in the family as often as the parent does. So you see, they're really on the same playing field. The permissive parents, there is no authority over the children within the home. And then during this portion of the PAQ, of the survey, they were instructed to think of the person who primarily took care of them in their formative years. So the person primarily charged with their care. So that was kind of clarified too, verbally within the survey. And so then the MSLQ, intrinsic motivation. In a class like this, I prefer course material that really challenges me so I can learn new things. So intrinsic motivation, the importance is on being challenged, gaining new knowledge for the sake of having that new knowledge. And then finally, the extrinsic motivation, getting a good grade in this class is the most satisfying thing for me right now. So you see the external reward of receiving the good grade or the grade that you would like is the most important thing that drives the external motivation orientation. And during the MSLQ, I asked the participants to think about only the class that the survey was administered in. I was trying to cut down on a broad range of feelings, because we approach our classes a little bit differently as far as gen ed requirements and then your major requirements. And so I just tried to focus the participants on the class that the survey was administered in. So this is the demographics information and the culmination of all of that information from the survey. And we'll talk about a few of the limitations of my research at this point in time too. So down here, you have the total N, or total number of participants, which is 60. That's a really small sample size. And so future research could include a larger sample size for that. And so we'll take each of the class rank, the ethnicity, and the gender kind of category by category so we can look at those. You'll see in class rank, the freshmen at 35 far outweigh any of the other categories, with sophomores at about half. So large disparity in class rank. Also in the ethnicity category, white, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic ethnicities far outweigh any of the other categories. And so future research could address that as well. Not a huge diversity within the research. And then finally, about half as many males as females. So there are some disparities that could be addressed in future research in a larger sample size. So the correlation matrix. This is the culmination of the research that I did from the surveys. What is correlation? It looks at relationships. So we're looking at the relationship between the parenting style, the variables of the parenting style, and the variables of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. I chose a correlational design because the students were reporting retrospectively how they were parented during their formative years. And so random assignment wasn't applicable in this situation, and so we look at relationships. I hypothesized that permissive parenting would not be correlated with either intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, and that's what I found. It was not positively or negatively correlated significantly with intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. I also found that for authoritative parenting, where I originally hypothesized that authoritative parenting would correlate with intrinsic motivation. I didn't find that either. Where I did find the significance was in the authoritarian parenting style. Now, you might remember that I hypothesized that authoritarian parenting would correlate with extrinsic motivation. It was a p-value, which distinguishes correlation. The p-value was at 0.095 for that correlation. We reached significance at 0.05. So it didn't quite reach significance, but it trended towards significance. And so not full support, maybe we could have seen that with a larger sample size. Maybe it might have made it all the way there, but it just didn't in my sample. However, what I did find that was interesting was that authoritarian parenting was negatively correlated with intrinsic motivation. And the p-value for that one was 0.048, so it did reach a significant level. Now we'll talk about the negative. The correlation is the Pearson's R, and it was at negative 0.256. What that means, when you find a negative correlation, that as one variable goes up, the other goes down. So as people identified as having more authoritarian parenting, their level of intrinsic motivation went down. Okay? So whereas I hypothesized that authoritarian would be linked with extrinsic, I figured that was a positive correlation. That's what I hypothesized. And so both of them would raise and be high. I did not find that. So it's the inverse of what I hypothesized, really. And so because you would expect, if I hypothesized a positive correlation, then the inverse of that would be a negative correlation with the exact opposite motivational orientation. So with the fact that this was trending towards significance, and I found the inverse of my hypothesis, there was a partial support, but not full support for my hypothesis. So, hypothesis was partially supported. Possible explanations, besides the demographic ones that we already talked about of a larger sample size, more diverse sample size. Possibly control and warmth may not accurately predict motivation in authoritatively parented kids. Or that striving for verbal or tangible approval and affirmation does not accurately predict motivation orientation in authoritarian raised children. Those are possible explanations of what I found that didn't quite align with the previous research. So, future directions, where to go from here. Further explore the root cause of goal orientation in a non-correlational setting, which could include a longitudinal design to follow children as they become students and then throughout their academic career. You could obtain accounts from parents, siblings, and the student to gain further insight into how a student becomes intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, and how this orientation could change over time, could change over the course of the academic career, and change into adulthood as well. So, why this research is important to me is because how we are parented does influence, how we operate through our life. It's interesting to see how students are motivated. This is a good teaching tool for teachers to where, okay, if they know the motivation orientation, then they're able to motivate their students. It's also a good educational tool for parents, a more adaptive way of parenting rather than, a stifling way of parenting. So educating parents on how to properly prepare children, how their parenting and how they interact with their children can affect academics, how they operate within the world and into adulthood. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Are there any questions?